oh, I think I have to accept this. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about Transformers Foundation, introduce myself, and then I'll tell you about the report and what we found. As Allison mentioned, it was a very collaborative project. There were a lot of individuals involved in this paper. So I will do my best to speak on our collective behalf. And then at the end, we'll open for questions. And as I said in the chat, I'm calling from Amsterdam. And so it's 6 p.m. here, and my daughter just got home from daycare. So if you hear a toddler tantruming in the background, that would be why. She's not unattended though, but she's with her dad, but you might hear her in the background. All right. So Transformers Foundation. Transformers Foundation is a relatively new organization. We were founded in 2020, and we were founded by the denim supply chain. And I think that's what kind of makes us unique relative to other organizations in this space, because our founders are denim suppliers from various places around the globe, from various tiers, everything from cotton growers to chemical companies making auxiliaries used in denim laundries, to jeans factories, mills, kind of the whole spectrum of the denim supply chain. And we were founded really because these denim suppliers felt like they wanted to have a more wanted to sort of amplify perspectives from the denim supply chain on how sustainability should be done. And this is a mission that resonates very strongly with me personally, because although my background is not in denim, specifically my background prior to actually also 2020 was working as a garment factory manager, which I did for about 5 years. So that is a little bit about Transformers Foundation. And Allison mentioned, if you can go to the next slide, thanks, that we put out in November a report. And every year, as Allison also mentioned, we try to put out a report that sort of reflects perspectives from the denim. And I say perspectives because it's almost never singular, but perspectives from the denim supply chain on issues related to sustainability. And the report this year is focused on climate action and perspectives from the denim supply chain on the sector's approach to climate action. Thanks, Annie, for putting the link to the report in the chat. And in a sentence, how I would summarize this report is that it explains how decarbonization has disproportionately become a supplier rather than collective responsibility, and not only why this is inequitable from an ethical standpoint, but also why it's just not really a pragmatic approach, and that we will fall short on our ambitious goals if this is the approach that we take. If you could go to the next slide. So at a very high level, the findings there were sort of 4 parts and 4 findings in this report. And the first one, and we organized them around sort of key questions. So the first question is around who should do how much. And when we talk about what I mean by this is, we have collectively in the form of the Paris Agreement, some society-wide goals on what we want to achieve around climate action. But how do we translate that goal into responsibilities for individual companies? And what we found was, the primary finding of this report was that actually the way that we answer this question, who should do how much, makes climate action disproportionately a supplier problem. And I'll explain a little bit more about how and why that happens in a moment. But as I said in the previous slide, we explore why that's not only inequitable, but also not practical. And that one of the main ways that this responsibility has been pushed down the supply chain is through the industry's pursuit of science-based targets, which I will come back to in a moment. The second finding and question that we looked at was around who pays. And what we found here is that actually this question is rarely explicitly asked, and that the industry really isn't engaging in a wider reckoning around funding, and that in practice, suppliers seem to be not only expected to do most of the work to decarbonize, but also pay for it. And the third question that we looked at was who and what drives change. So what we found here was that, the sector's approach to climate action is really coming out of a decades-long top-down approach to sustainability that really just isn't working. And that if we were to have sort of change coming in a more bottom-up way, the way that we approach climate action would look very different. I will get into some examples of that later in the presentation. And the last thing that we looked at in this paper is where does legislation, particularly in the United States, in the EU, in Canada, in Australia, the UK, where does that fit in? And we didn't do a comprehensive mapping, but we looked at a few case studies to look at how legislators seemed to be thinking about holding brands and retailers operating or headquartered in their jurisdictions accountable for emissions in their supply chains. And what we found was that actually they seem to be reinforcing this idea of targets as a solution and an end in and of themselves, and that it's a missed opportunity to enable climate action in other ways, which I will come to again later. So that is, in brief, the report. If you could go to the next slide, please, Allison. Yes, thank you. So in the who should do how much. So in the report, we outline what is the sector's current approach to this issue and again, when I say who should do how much, what I mean is how do we distribute responsibility for this collective society level goal? And the current approach that we found, and this is what suppliers that we interviewed told us, is that increasingly brands and retailers require, and the Science Based Target Initiative also recommends, that their suppliers, that a brand and retailer suppliers sets their own science-based targets. And the concept of science-based targets is also advocated for by a lot of other entities in the sector, multi-stakeholder initiatives that require signing up to science-based targets to become members, things like that. And the important thing to understand about science-based targets is that they basically, in my head, I think of it like a pie. We have this collective society-wide goal, the Paris Agreement. And what science-based targets does is it takes that pie and it divides it up into equally sized slices. And it says everybody has to do the same amount towards this collective goal and at the same pace. And in the paper, we refer to this as like flat targets. So the idea that everybody, sort of irrespective of context, irrespective of what you're making, has to contribute the same amount. And what we found, if you could go to the next slide, is that, this seems like an equal approach because all companies, are sort of setting the similar targets and doing their fair share, so to speak. Everyone's like chipping in and doing their part. But in reality, this places enormous demands on apparel and textile suppliers specifically because by some estimates, more than 90% of a brand or retailer's emissions occur in what's known as a brand or retailer's scope 3, and at least 80% of emissions are concentrated in the process of making and manufacturing raw materials and apparel. So in other words, because most of the emissions are in production and in the supply chain, when you take this collective goal and you sort of carve it up equally, actually what that means is that there's a much heavier lift and there's a lot more action required from factories, from production facilities who are primarily based in the global south and that also historically, on the whole, have not contributed as much to climate change. Actually historically and in many cases also still today. So, and then the other issue here is also, of course, around profitability and margins, because what we're then doing is we're saying, okay, all of the work has to happen in the part of the supply chain where there are actually the fewest resources, and the entities that are taking home the smallest piece of, and I'm going to use the pie analogy again, but in a different sense. And so that was sort of around the equity piece that we found. But what we also found, or what the denim suppliers that we spoke to for this report also told us, was that if you put the equity piece aside for a moment, the other really important thing that they wanted to make sure was emphasized is that it's also not practical. Because what they told us was that, if your approach to sort of deciding who should do how much is to sort of flatly distribute responsibility, then in order for that to work as a strategy, then all companies have to be technically capable of decarbonizing to the same extent. And what the suppliers that we spoke to told us is that this simply isn't the case. And they identified layer upon layer of contextual factors that would sort of determine their opportunity space or their potentiality from a decarbonization perspective. And I can give some examples of that if you go to the next slide. But in the report, and we go into a lot more detail on this in the report, and if you're sort of interested, if the idea of like decarbonization feels really abstract to you and it's hard to sort of, and you're feeling like you're having a hard time getting your head around like what in practice that actually means. What are we actually asking of factories? I encourage you to go and look at this report because I think that's one of the things that it does quite well. But what we do is we look at basically, let's say you're a factory and you've been asked to decarbonize. You basically have two different strategies. You can either switch your energy source to an alternative energy source. So if you're drawing your energy from the grid in your operating context, and the energy and there isn't very much renewable energy available through your national grid, then you would have sort of different levers that you could pull to sort of switch your alternative energy to an alternative energy source. So for example, you could generate your own renewable source for electricity through solar panels or through a wind farm. You could set up a power purchase agreement. You could purchase renewable energy certificates, and those come with their own controversies, and we're not endorsing or supporting any of these approaches, but these are kind of just to give you a sense of what levers you might have. So those are sort of three different options you might have if you don't have renewable electricity sources available through the grid. And the way that context shapes your extent, or the extent to which any of these three things that I've just mentioned might be an option to you, could be, if I'll give you some concrete examples, but we had mills tell us, yes, we've invested in solar panels, but actually technically the amount of energy that we need could just never be met by solar panels alone. Or other people said to us, we have looked at wind farms, but like building codes and regulations don't really allow us to do that. Or we had other suppliers tell us, I have a really vertical facility and I have very limited roof space on my building. So even though I actually might technically be able to meet all of my energy requirements through solar panels based on, the amount of sunlight I have available to me and all the rest, I actually just don't have enough space to put them. And the same with power purchase agreements, because here too, we talked to, for instance, suppliers in Pakistan who said, we just don't have power purchase agreements available in our country. And, we can't be, if this is not an option for us, we can't be expected to sort of use this as a lever. We also talked to suppliers in India who said, this is really variable even, by province, how available the option of a power purchase agreement might be. And even with RECs, actually, which, we can debate sort of how great of a strategy this is, but even with RECs, people said, we talked to one supplier in Bangladesh who said, RECs are really expensive here, and the cost is again very variable by context. So that's just to give you a flavor of how sort of contextual factors might shape a supplier's ability to switch to an alternative energy source if renewable electricity isn't available through the grid. The other thing that we look at in the report is what are the sort of options or levers that a supplier might be able to pursue in terms of decarbonizing their thermal loads. And by thermal loads here, really all I mean is heat. How do you generate heat? And if you imagine that you have a boiler that is creating steam power for your factory, you could have a boiler that you plug into the wall and is running on electricity. Now, again, you have to have a renewable electricity source for that to be feasible. But a lot, and so some suppliers who are able to do that do that. But what the suppliers that we spoke to said is that, electric boilers are really only viable for sort of relatively limited thermal energy requirements. So for example, if you're a cut and sew factory that is using relatively a lot less steam power, but still some steam power, but less steam power than say a mill, yeah, maybe you could use an electric boiler. But if you're a mill, the amount of steam power that you would need is, just not, it's not technically viable to generate that through an electric boiler. So there again, we have, contextual factors, in this case, maybe not based on place, but based on the production processes that you're running. You could also switch to lower carbon fuels. So for example, if your boiler is running on coal, you could maybe switch to natural gas. Now, again, that's probably not a long-term solution, but it's something that you could do that would reduce your emissions in the short term. But here too, for instance, we talked to suppliers in Bangladesh who said, we're already using a lot of natural gas and most of our boilers are running on natural gas. So this isn't an option available to us, whereas, suppliers in other contexts said that this was something that they had done or were looking at doing. Or the other option or lever that a supplier might have is maybe you would, maybe you would look at fueling, instead of fueling your boiler with coal, maybe you would feed it with biofuels instead of fossil fuels. So, and there again, there's different debates on how effective that is, but this is one of the levers. And what we had a lot of suppliers tell us is, in some contexts, suppliers were like, yeah, we're doing that. It's great. And I mean, this is an option that we have available and that we're pursuing. And in other contexts, people said, oh, well, actually, we don't have a biofuel supply chain, because what we mean by biofuel when we were in the context of these conversations with suppliers is we were talking about the use of agricultural waste to fuel these boilers. And they said, like, I'll just give you an example. We spoke to one supplier in India who said, like, agricultural waste is seasonal. So like the kind of, I can maybe get it for part of the year, but not for the whole year. Or others said to us, the agricultural waste that we have available to us is not very dense, meaning it's voluminous, meaning we need a lot of it to be able to fuel our boilers. And that is expensive to transport. So it's increasing our operating expenses. So again, just some examples of how context might shape the extent to which a supplier is able to decarbonize. And the second sort of umbrella or bucket of things that you could look at besides switching to alternative energy, which is the second point on this slide, is the feasibility of just energy efficiency gains, so using less of the energy. And here too, people brought up contextual factors like, how skilled was the engineering force that you had available to you in your context? Things that, I mean, you would think, basically things that impacted their extent to look at these solutions that were kind of outside of their control. So that is on the who should do how much question, and why we found that it was inequitable and also impractical. The next question is who pays? Thank you. And as I said in the beginning of this presentation, the current approach to this question within the sector, at least this is what we found, is that this question is rarely explicitly asked. And that because most of the emissions are in the supply chain and it's their facilities and processes that need to change, it's sort of implicitly assumed that they'll also be the ones to foot the bill. And that most of the available funding in the sector for factory level decarbonization projects are primarily still debt-based. And so they assume basically the assumption is that suppliers will take on that debt, they'll take on the project risk associated with that. And there's also an assumption that this work, of course they should take on that debt because the work's going to generate returns. It's going to make them lots of money. It's good for business. And what we found was that, in fact, if you go to the next slide, the suppliers that we talked to kind of said, we have two sort of types of funding needs that we need to have met. There are certainly some investments that have paybacks and where, they make good business sense. There's a business case to do these investments. And but even for those there are a lot of projects that have fast paybacks that make good business sense that aren't happening. And the reason for that is sometimes and they broke the barriers down into sort of three categories. They said sometimes there's not enough funding available. I mean, in other words, there's just not enough money. Sometimes it was that there was funding available, but it wasn't accessible. And sometimes it was that it was too expensive, so it wasn't affordable. And the second sort of type of funding need that they identified was long-term or no payback projects. And here, these were projects that, offered very limited or even no payback. So the business case was a lot tougher to make and that were kind of too risky for suppliers to shoulder themselves. And across, and here too, they identified barriers in terms of the availability of funding, accessibility, and affordability of funding. And I'm just going to share a couple of quotes that sort of articulate this if you go to the next slide. So one person said, there are certain decarbonization efforts that may not offer immediate or any financial gains, such as replacing cheap fossil fuels like coal or natural gas with solar, thermal, or biomass. To bridge this gap, we must recognize that external funding support that is not debt is the catalyst that empowers us to invest in rapid decarbonization of the supply chain. One thing I do want to note about this quote that I think can be confusing is, or I've had people ask me about since this report came out, is, what are the investments that have paybacks and what are the investments that don't have paybacks? And can you please categorize them for me? And this quote also refers to, gives an example of an investment that in their case did not have payback. And that's, I think, the important thing to note is whether an investment generates a return is also highly contextual. Because if you think about it, it depends on, if fossil fuels are cheap where you're operating, the payback's going to be longer. If fossil fuels are expensive, the payback's going to be quicker. So, and also, sometimes the costs of these investments are variable. We had suppliers tell us like, oh, I'm operating in a context where the machinery I would need is heavily, there's a lot of import duties on it. And others were like, oh, I can buy that from a local manufacturer. So it's not possible to just sort of say, absolutely, this project has a payback or a long payback, and this project has a quick payback. Even that is sort of contextual, but what the supplier is really emphasizing is that, that we need to be looking at funding support that's not debt to empower us to invest in rapid decarbonization. And the next quote, there's one more quote related to this point that I wanted to share, which is speaking to these sort of the projects that do have paybacks. So we've seen plenty of companies who are not doing the investment, not because they don't have fast payback projects, but because there are constraints that block them from accessing the finance, which could simply be not having future visibility to orders. So for example, that they have no idea how many orders they're going to get from their customers, and so they're unable to go to a bank to take out a loan. Sometimes it was that the, interest rates were too high. Sometimes it was like, people brought up things like, there were loans that were available, but they were only offered in hard currency, and that made it too risky for them to take on the investment. Because, if their currency suddenly devalued, then the value of their debt was going to balloon. And in some cases, people said, I'm operating in a country that just doesn't even allow loans in hard currency. So there's different aspects to this as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the third question that we organized our findings around was who and what will drive change. And what, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, what we kind of found is that implicitly the sector's current approach to this question is that change has to be top down. It has to be directive. You know, brands and retailers or consumers or whomever it might be have to sort of put pressure on the supply chain to change and to say, hey, you need to do this or you need to do that, or else, you know, or else. And what we found, if you go to the next slide, is that, you know, we found kind of a juxtaposition, because on the one hand, everything I've just shared with you sort of points to the fact that context is everything, that the solutions are going to be different depending on, you know, all kinds of factors, contextual factors. And so on the one hand, we have this approach to sustainability in general, including the sort of setting and meeting of science-based targets, which is premised, I think, on this assumption that change has to be directive and come from the top down. On the other hand, we have this reality that these extremely long and fragmented supply chains that sort of are typical of the sector kind of and that are sort of designed to minimize risk for global brands and retailers, make it very difficult, if not impossible, for those same brands and retailers to actually direct the bespoke and customized context-specific approaches that would be needed to drive meaningful decarbonization impact. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll just give a few examples of quotes from people that will give you a sense of how this plays out then in practice. But, you know, we had one person say, brands want solar panels, for instance, on factory rooftops. But what good are those panels if the factories are going to go underwater, or if the area becomes too hot to humanely humanely live in? And actually, I want to go back a step because the other thing, that the bigger picture consequence of this top-down and directive approach to climate action that we heard from suppliers is actually a very narrow and privileged framing of the issue of climate change itself. So what a lot of the suppliers that we spoke to said to us is that, you know, the fact that climate action has become synonymous with decarbonization is itself indicative of who has had a seat at the table in terms of shaping what the agenda looks like. Because they said, you know, had we had a seat at the table in sort of influencing and shaping the sector's approach to this issue, we would frame it a lot more broadly than decarbonization. We would also be talking about adaptation. We would be talking about resilience, because most of these suppliers were located in countries that are most vulnerable to climate change and also employ some of the people most vulnerable to climate change related disruption. And so they really emphasized that, you know, this sort of narrow focus on decarbonization is sort of indicative of this brand-driven, top-down, global north-driven nature of the conversation. So the next quote is, the issue is that if you think about us as a manufacturer, I think there are three funding requirements that we will need. One is the funding that is needed for decarbonization. Second will be the funding for climate resilience. And third will be the funding to support employees who may be highly vulnerable to climate-related disasters. So as long as we keep our conversation purely on decarbonization, the other two areas go out of sight and out of mind and become exclusively a manufacturer's commitment or a manufacturer's problem. And on this theme, somebody else said, resilience and adaptation and worker well-being related to climate is never part of the conversation because it's not useful for a brand to have that conversation. So if we want to really change that, we have to really talk about this power. So those are some examples of things that people said to us during our research around this question of who and what drives change, and should our point of departure be that change has to come from the top, or could we look at, you know, could our starting point be that change is contextual, that there are different solutions that will be needed in different places, and that therefore a sort of directive one-size-fits-all approach might not necessarily make sense. So you go to the next slide. The last thing that we looked at in the paper was regulation, as I mentioned, and where Global North regulation fits into this picture. And as I said, we didn't do a comprehensive mapping, but we looked at 3 examples of legislation and sort of how they're looking to hold brands and retailers accountable for the emissions in their supply chains. We specifically looked at the CSDDD at the EU level, the CSRD also at the EU level, and the New York Fashion Act. And all 3 of these legislative efforts that we looked at emphasize, and in some cases even mandate, science-based targets as the primary tool to reduce emissions, or to demonstrate that they're taking action on climate change. And what we felt was that this really was a missed, opportunity, because instead that, and one of the things we put forward in the paper is that maybe instead of focusing on target setting, legislators should be focused on, how do we open up funding and capital to finance this transition. And one of the just to give you an example, one of the suggestions that a supplier made who was interviewed for this report said, why don't they require, for instance, why don't we use legislation to set up funds, collective funds that we are all contributing into that are then being used to fund decarbonization? Somebody else said, why don't they make brands and retailers actually report on, the emissions reductions that they and their supply chains have achieved, but to differentiate emissions reductions that they're claiming basically through no action of their own, that they haven't really done anything to sort of make happen or contribute to, emissions reductions that have happened with their technical support, and then emissions reductions that have happened where they've actually contributed financially. These were our sort of key findings on regulation. And if you go to the next slide, thank you, Allison. In our conclusion, we call for a collective approach. Now, I know that this word collective is really kind of a buzzword in the sector, so we wanted to be really explicit about what it means and define it. So in the next slide, yes, you will see a definition. And it's really simple. We define collective action or a collective approach as shared ownership and shared responsibility. And this requires, I think, shifting responsibility for climate action from suppliers to one that's shared across the value chain. Instead of it being a supplier problem, it has to be our problem. What that means is that targets, funding, risk, and activities are collective, and that this is really the only way that will sort of accelerate the pace of change. And what we put forward in the report is that practically the first step towards a collective approach is actually decoupling or separating this who does how much question from this who pays question. Because at the moment, I mean, we can't change the fact that the bulk of the emissions are in the supply chain. That sort of is the reality that we're with. But just because that's where the emissions are doesn't mean, or should not mean, that those entities are automatically responsible for footing the bill. And what we suggest is that these 2 pieces of the puzzle, where the work needs to be done and who pays for it, need to be solved separately. And that contribution should be linked to the ability to pay and could factor in equity, margins, and historical emissions, for example. And that this, for us, really is the first and most important step towards a collective approach. And I want to, if you go to the next slide, I want to go to give you a really practical example of what a collective approach might look like versus the current paradigm. So if you were to take a collective approach, your sort of starting assumption is that decarbonization is a value chain responsibility. It's our collective responsibility. And out of that might come a program, which I sort of alluded to earlier already, which it might, for instance, be that all value chain actors contribute a percentage of revenue into a collectively managed climate fund. And in that case, the risk is shared. And the contribution is coming from all parts of the value chain based on equity and ability to pay and margins. In an approach that's not collective, the starting assumption would be implicitly, rarely explicitly, is that decarbonization is an individual supplier's responsibility. And a program that might come out of this kind of assumption is, for instance, a brand lending money to a supplier to fund its decarbonization efforts. But in that approach, the risk still sits with the supplier. The supplier takes the project and the credit risk. And in the end, the contribution is also coming from the supplier because it's debt. The money has to be paid back. And if anything, a brand might be making interest on that debt. And so that's for us an example that we put forward of what would be a collective approach versus what isn't. I know that was a lot of information, so I'll just maybe pause there and open it up for questions. And I see there's quite a lot of activity in the chat, which I haven't been keeping up with, so I'll maybe take a minute to catch up.
Thank you, Kim. And yeah, if anybody has questions, please feel free to either type them in the chat or just come off mute and you could just ask them off that way. I think that this report is so important to show why, worker voices and people on the ground, their voices are so important. Oh, I see, Bryce, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really, really think this is a fantastic report, by the way. This is like absolutely like
Thank you.
Feast of Resistance, honestly, and I like how visual it is as well, which is even good for for a neurodivergent person like myself to see all this. Um, I'm wondering, is there been any sort of like research done into like, 'cause I know that there's like quite a lot of the garment industry is quite water intensive industry, and basically, um, what is happening just now is there's been some pilot projects happening in Scotland and in the UK actually on leveraging basically computer heat. So computers and servers, which are done within the creative industry, there's a lot of need for like that rendering of images. And that's quite a server intensive, computer intensive operation, which requires a heck of a lot of cooling. And one of the things which there's been some research done is using the computer heat to actually build up thermal, basically a thermal
Mm,
battery within water course, and basically to basically build up heat. And I'm wondering, is that could there be also inside that um thermal, like the heat that's generated inside the boilers, to be able to use maybe like a heat transfer system where the heat actually provides electricity through like a technological system. I don't know, maybe a thing, and actually basically that could be able to power that, because I know that in areas and such as like Bangladesh, India, and potentially Pakistan, there's quite precarious like loading on the electricity grid, and it's quite like
mm,
sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off, and it's not really quite a lot of like there's not like a continuity. There's not like a really
yeah.
a consistent system. So I'm wondering is if there's been any like research done where we can where is they using like the traditional like heat pumps or using like solar
Yeah.
panels and stuff like that. Has there been any research in other alternative ways in which we could leverage that? Because I think that that's somewhat something which I'm curious to basically to look at, because I remember watching um a video by ACS Clothing in UK and Scotland, who basically talked about their issues with heating water and storing heated water, because heating is quite a it can be quite a powerful thermal source, but it's also quite difficult to convert into electricity and other things like that. Sorry if I'm taking a long time to come to that, but I'm just really quite curious about how we can be able to support precarious grids to transfer over to a much more sustainable and consistent energy source. Sorry if I came quite long to that point,
No,
but thank you very much.
that's fine. So there was one, I've just put the link in the chat. It's in the footnotes of our report. So there is one study that's looking at electrification of heating in the textile industry, a techno-economic analysis, and it's looking specifically at China, Japan, and Taiwan. And one of the things that they look at in that report is the viability of heat pumps. That my understanding from the suppliers that we spoke to, and this is also alluded to in the report, is that technically, like heat pumps specifically, it's kind of a long link. It starts with like, well, if you go into the report and look at footnote 34, that's where you'll also find it. But that the viability of heat pumps sort of remains questionable in terms of its ability to evenly and consistently and to very high temperatures heat the water to the extent that a denim mill would need it. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's work being done on this. And you raised another really interesting point, which we also bring up in the report, but I thought it was maybe kind of a lot of detail to bring in here. But yeah, a lot of suppliers said, look, even if we could totally electrify our thermal load, and even if our grid was 100%, renewable electricity, our grids just, if all of the factories in our country like switched to that, our grids would just crash. The infrastructure isn't there for it. And that was also a concern that was your concern is a concern that was also raised by the many of the people that we spoke to in the interviews and the research for this report. So I think that is a concern, and again speaks to the need to sort of look at these, look at sort of this, and one of the calls to action that we have in our report is the need for sort of we have sort of a sector-wide roadmap to achieving our decarbonization goals. AII, the Apparel Impact Institute, has put out a sort of sector-level roadmap. But, that sector-level roadmap doesn't help or doesn't necessarily always translate well in a, when you're a firm, when you're a company dealing with a very specific set of circumstances, and that there is a need to develop roadmaps that are maybe specific to a given place, maybe even a province. I don't even mean country, but a given province, and maybe even looking at specific production tiers to look at some of these questions that you have raised.
Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. And I think what would be quite could maybe just quickly just to say I think would be quite interesting to actually look at is if there's any residual like electricity being used or electricity being generated at these things when the transition effectively happens, is actually storing that in batteries and potentially offering that out to workers to help them to be able to have their own resilient battery system within their homes, for example, and basically be able to help them to with like cost of living and stuff like that. That might be quite useful to maybe probe looking at hot swappable batteries at the factory where they can just like take the battery home with them, put the battery back inside when they come to work, and they can be able to recharge that battery. I think that'd be quite interesting to see.
I see another question in the chat. Should I answer that one, Allison, or yeah? How much do you think brand level degrowth would impact suppliers' ability to decarbonize? This is a tough question, but I think, we did speak to many of the suppliers that we spoke to said, I would love to produce fewer products, but better quality products sold at a higher price point. But that they weren't really getting demand for that. So I think that your question, I don't know if I necessarily have an answer, but many, other than to say that many of the suppliers sort of raised this point as well. And what they also said was that in fact, when we talk about science-based targets, and again, this sort of flat approach to distributing responsibility for a collective goal, because what one supplier in particular really felt very passionately about was that, for global brands and retailers who, number one, are not doing production, and number two, tend to be operating in places where maybe they do have more renewable access to renewable energy, that they could achieve their targets without compromising growth because they're not making stuff in the same way. Whereas for manufacturers, if they're going to hit those science-based targets, there's really no way for them to do that without sort of compromising or making choices about their growth. Are they going to invest, if you're even, let's say they do have the funds themselves to make some of these investments, are you going to invest in building your new factory, or are you going to invest that money in your decarbonization goals? And that's like a choice and a trade-off that these manufacturers might have to make that doesn't apply to global brands and retailers in the same way. And they felt that that was very inequitable. What makes for a good science-based target? So we actually also talk about this in the report because I think, well, for me personally, this word science is kind of tricky because, and what I mean by that is at the end of the day, what science-based targets are doing is, like I said, you have this collective approach, the Paris Agreement, and it's translating that into targets for individual companies. And nobody is disputing the science behind the Paris Agreement or saying, that these things, that we need to sort of decelerate or progress or to do anything at a slower pace. And in fact, most of the suppliers that we interviewed for this report are also leaders in this space. And the last thing that they want is to sort of, come up with excuses for slower action. So we have, a sort of scientific consensus that sort of supports the Paris Agreement. But how you then distribute that is actually not exclusively a science question. It is also an ethical question. These are normative questions about how do you distribute responsibility for this scientific sort of reality. And I think this term science-based targets makes it hard to have that conversation because at least many of the suppliers that we spoke to sort of expressed to us that they had a hard time coming out and saying that they were struggling with science-based targets or that they maybe disagreed with science-based targets because then they would be met with, well, what, you don't believe in the science? And actually that wasn't really, their point, but that's kind of the binary that's set up with that language. And what we also do advocate in the report is what we call a differentiated approach to target setting. And there are other approaches to target setting, and I can there's a really good article. I'll put the link, I'll try again to put the link in the chat. There's a really good article here in the MIT review. And in that MIT review, it actually makes reference to sort of competing methodologies that were at play before science-based, for distributing this collective goal, before science-based targets became the sort of go-to approach. And it sort of outlines different approaches. But in the report, broadly, what we call for is what we refer to as a differentiated approach to target setting, which means saying, okay, collectively, we have to sort of, again, if I go back to the pie, we have to eat this whole pie, right? But maybe instead of distributing it equally, what we're going to do is we're going to distribute it, you know, in a differentiated way where different actors contribute different amounts to that pie, both based on sort of practical and feasibility considerations, but also equity considerations. I hope that answers your question.
We do have about 5 minutes left, so if anybody else has any questions for Kim about the report, feel free to put them in the chat or come off mute. We will also have this recording in the Ambassador Resource Drive that I'll share in Slack after the call. So if you want to watch it back or read the report or anything, we'll have a folder in the Ambassador Resource Drive with all of that information.
Thanks, Allison. This is actually like the first time that I've presented on this and had enough time to get through everything. And I think the report came out in November, so I've been making the rounds with these presentations quite a bit. So I think in a way you guys have gotten the sort of most streamlined, condensed version.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely amazing. And I highly recommend, we did drop the report in the chat a bunch. If you haven't read it yet, definitely take a look at it. There's like some amazing like graphs and visuals in there as well as just like a ton of information and points to a bunch of other research too. So yeah, I also saw a bunch of things in the chat. You know, thank you so much, Kim. This was amazing. People's minds, I feel like, were blown. It was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but you did such an amazing job making it very digestible.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having us. And I do encourage you to go and read the report because, as I said, I think one of the contributions of this report is to make this what I think is for many people a very abstract idea, a very sort of tangible and concrete project or endeavor. And I think, you know, we definitely need more of that in the sector. And if you're somebody who's feeling like, I mean, for context, I studied human rights. I have sort of ended up in this decarbonization space a little bit by accident or unintentionally, but of course, as a factory manager, like I had a little bit of insight into some of these issues, but thank you for having us and for taking the time to engage and to read the report.
Amazing.
Oh, and I should also say that somebody mentioned the graphic design, and Annie is here on this call, and it was Annie, and actually I think Macy's here too. Annie and Macy were the ones spearheading the graphic design, and I agree they did a fabulous job because it was kind of a technical report, and I think that they did such a good job of making it feel a little bit more accessible.
Big shout out to Macy.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Kim and Annie, for making this presentation possible and joining us. Like I said, I will have the recording out. I will share it to everybody who signed up on the Ticket Tailor and then also in the Ambassador Slack channel so you could watch it or share it afterwards. And then Kim and Annie, I will also send the recording to you guys. So thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Yes, have a great rest of your day. Likewise.
Oh, quick
Thank
question.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I was wondering, how do you take this information and like disseminate it, especially if you're like a new ambassador and you don't have a lot of like depth, like in this field? What are the channels that you feel people would want to utilize this information?
is that Allison? Do you want to? Or Emily, I don't know, it seems like a remake. Is this a question for a remake or for us?
I think it's more remake, but it's both. like where, how would you go about like sharing this, especially these people who maybe are not as involved?
Yes.
We'd be happy to chat with you more about this. If you're over on the Remake Ambassador Slack or have access to our Ambassador Resource Drive, we'll be posting the recording as well as the report link there. And please just shoot us a message. We'd be happy to chat about how you can utilize these tools in your workplace, what are some of the strategies you could use for deploying these learnings, and support you on that journey.
All right, thank you. I'll message you on there. All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.